So my name is Anthony Fuentes, and I am a full stack developer on the HUBzero CMS development team. All right, so today I put together a presentation on the basics of creating and accessing an API endpoint on a hub. And I've got some slides that I'll go through that sort of detail or go over the basic steps. And I also put together a demo component that uses an API endpoint so I can sort of demo some of what I'll be talking about. So just to start off, you can find documentation at your hub. So you go to your hub's root URL and then /developer and /API, and you'll find your hub's API. You can go to the docs from there. I put in my development hub there. And so that'll give you sort of an overview on how to use the API primarily for intra-hub requests, meaning you're making requests to an endpoint from web pages that your hub serves. We also have a page that goes over intra-hub requests. So if you're trying to access a hub API endpoint from an external system, you can visit help.hubzero.org documentation 2.20 web devs API. So to create an endpoint, you're going to want to create an API directory in the root directory of your component. So say you have com2do, you'll create an API directory. From there, you'll implement a router that'll route through your incoming requests, and that extends HUBzero component router base. And once you're done with that, you just basically create a directory of controllers that respond to the requests you get. These controllers are different from your sort of standard hub controllers in that they extend the HUBzero API controller as opposed to HUBzero component admin or site controller. Another thing that, one thing that the HUBzero API supports that may be new is endpoint versioning. So the reason that's there is to make sure that when you create an endpoint and then want to change it in the future, you can create a new version rather than breaking any code that depends on the responses that it would receive from your previous implementation of the API. And in order to create a new endpoint version, you have to create a new router. So for example, say you have API endpoint version 2.5, you'll create a router with the file name router v2_5.php, and the class name doesn't change, so it's just going to stay class router extends base. You'll also create new controllers for the new API endpoint version. So the file name, for instance, would be widgets v2_5.php, and the class name for that API controller will be widgets v2_5, and that'll of course extend API controller. And so in order to access different endpoint versions, you have a couple of different options. So one, in the URL, you can put v and then the version number. So here, breaking from version 2.5 to 1.3 would be v1.3 and then / the resource. So here is groups. You can also do it via the query string parameter. You can pass either version and provide a value 1.3, or you can just pass v. You can also use a custom header like this one here. So accessing an endpoint via the HUBzero JS library. So why use this way to access a Hub API endpoint? The primary reason is that's going to handle getting an API access token for you. So it's generally a good idea to protect your endpoints by requiring authentication. That way, you're not exposing your hub to people who, if you have sensitive data, or just having to respond to clients you don't want to respond to. And so what that does for you is it automatically will get an access token based on the active user session for whatever browser session that is active. and it's going to be used by jQuery in AJAX requests. So in order to set this up, what you have to do is in your view file that loads the script that'll be making the jQuery AJAX requests. So in that view file, you're going to invoke behavior with an argument core on the HTML constant. So this will load the HUBzero JS object. Then in your JavaScript file where you're going to be making those requests to your API endpoint, you'll call init API on the HUBzero JS object, and you'll pass that a callback with your code. And so this will handle the API authentication for you. So if you want to make requests to a Hub API and you're not going to have access to the HUBzero JS object, so say you're doing it from an external application, you can create a developer app on the Hub and then generate a personal access token. And then what you'll do is you'll send that access token in the authorization header, like so, and you'll be able to access your API endpoint just as if you were using the HUBzero JS object. So in order to create a developer app, you'll go to your Hub's /developer/API/applications URL. You'll click on the new application and you'll create a personal access token from there. It's pretty straightforward. But if you get stuck, I'll give out my email and you can feel free to send me any questions. Yeah, and once you have that application generated, you just click Create Personal Access Token. One thing to note here that may trip you up is that once you generate a personal access token, the actual access token is going to be displayed in a header. Now, once that sort of like a pop-up notification on the Hub, and once that goes away, you cannot access that token again. So you're going to want to make sure that you record it somewhere safe. You can always revoke the token, say you forgot it or you lost it. You can revoke that token, which will effectively delete it and generate a new one. Some best practices when creating an API endpoint is to write doc blocks for all your API response handling functions. Otherwise, you'll get an error. So it's just good practice to document what your endpoint is expecting and what it returns. And like I was saying earlier, another good thing to do is to require authentication. If you invoke this function, this requires authentication in your controller's endpoint. It'll make sure that the request it has an access. The request that it's responding to has an access token. Some gotchas, just to make sure you don't run into any sticking points, are the API router class should be named router. That's it. So I was saying earlier that if you have a router that's routing for the v2.5, so version 2.5 endpoint, it'll be named in a specific way, v2_5. So for the 1.00 version of your endpoint, it doesn't have any special naming. It's just leave it as router. And the other thing is that the class name of an API controller has to match the file name. So I talked about this earlier, but it's just a good reminder because it's easy to forget these details. So if you have an items controller and it's the version 1 items controller, your class will be items v1_0, and the file name should be items v1_0.php. And so here's a link to the reference sort of demo component that I had that I'll be demoing here in a minute. All right, I'm going to switch over and share my browser so I can walk you through that demo. All right, can everybody see my browser pretty well? I'll take that as a yes. Enlarge the font a little bit. How's that? Perfect. All right. So yeah, I've got a couple links here at the sort of top level of my component. One is for intra-site requests and one is for external. We'll start with intra-site. So here I've got a couple of different API endpoints and just a couple simple forms that are going to be posting to my endpoint via jQuery's AJAX function and also retrieving data. So basic CRUD functions. To start, let's see what's there. If I fetch, I get this response, and this is basically what it looks like in code as well. Kept this really simple. So we see that the version of the response is 1.0, and that's just something I put in there to indicate the endpoint is 1.0. The status is success, and we have a key to do items with an array in it, and we can see there's one object in the array that has an ID of 1 and a description of first. So if we wanted to add another, just an example to show that this is going to be posting to that endpoint, I'll save a to-do with the description second, and we'll fetch it from the v2. So here we can see that the version is 2.0 as opposed to 1.0. Again, the status is success, and we've got that to-do items key with an array of objects, but this time we have a second object in there, and it has the description second. And we can delete something, so let's delete this first object just to go through all the CRUD actions. So we deleted it, and now when we fetch again, it's gone. And I also put a little bit of a demonstration purpose. If I create something by posting to the v2, the second version of the API, we see in here that it adds 2.0 to the end of the description. I did that just to differentiate, sort of show a tangible difference there. And so back to here, we can go back to here, look at external requests. I only came up with one version endpoint since one endpoint version since it was going to be pretty much the same thing. The difference here you can't really see in the browser is that rather than using the HUBzero.init API way of gaining authentication for the endpoint, I'm actually posting an access token every time with my request. So we'll create another to-do item, and we'll see there it is when I fetch. And we'll just delete. Let's go ahead and delete the one with ID 3. Fetch, everything's still working. And from here, I can answer any questions you have, or I can go into the code. It's really up to you. Does anyone have any questions? All right, silent crowd. What do you think, Claire? Where should I go from here?
I think it might be interesting to show off what we were kind of talking about earlier related to what you've done with API and
Sure. Right. So one example of a real use case that I used the API for was on the forum in a hub. So I created an email settings menu that uses the API to create subscriptions. So this is something that you can configure on your hub, and basically what it allows users to do is to subscribe to a specific thread within a forum as opposed to the whole forum. That way they only get notifications on posts to a specific thread. But the API aspect of it is, so here we can see that if I do a full browser refresh, the email settings, it's showing that I'm subscribed to C. If I unselect C and then click Save, you'll see that the browser doesn't refresh, but I get this notification that the subscriptions were deleted. And now if I do a full browser refresh, C is still unchecked. So basically it just sent a message to this API endpoint and said, delete this subscription. And sort of the whole idea behind doing that here was to just provide a little bit better of an experience for the user rather than having to reload the entire page to submit that form. It happens behind the scenes.